What's going on, YouTube family? It's Smile Abdul-Salam, beatsboxingmayhem.com. Just here with a quick video. Wanted to recap last night's Showtime triple header headlined by Danny Garcia's return against Jose Benavidez. Um, what to say about this fight? So there wasn't a lot of fanfare going into this fight. The card, I mean, the venue wasn't sold out. People there said it was about 75% full. There was some people actually speculating that Benavidez had a chance. I was very surprised by that. I know the big caveat or question mark here was Danny Garcia moving up to 154 pounds. Never fought there before. Wasn't a particularly big welterweight, so we know as super welterweight, he really wasn't going to be undersized. But when you look at the factors in this fight, number one, Danny has a much better pedigree as a fighter, more skilled, fought better opponents. Uh, Even though all the criticism we've seen of Danny being, kind of a plodding fighter, slow with his footwork, he's never had a problem with his timing. And Benavidez, because we know of the leg injury from the gunshot, he's even more plodding and slower with hand and foot speed than Danny. And on top of that, he had a low punch output. So, and he's not able to really put pressure on like he used to because of the leg injury. So with all those factors in, I didn't give Benavidez much of a chance to pull this one out. And then on top of that, one other thing I forgot to mention, we of course know Danny's chin. So it wasn't like he had the opportunity to really, knock Danny out or anything like that. So I was not surprised by this unanimous decision win. The only surprise was really that one scorecard of 114, 114, which was completely egregious. I gave probably Benavidez no more than about 3 rounds. Comfortable win for Danny. He was able to dictate the pace, counterpunch, was able to land at times 3 to 4 punch combinations without really much coming back in return because Benavidez was so slow. He was kind of regulated to just kind of trying to taunt and shake his head while getting hit with these punches. So a solid comeback for Danny after 19 months out the ring. We got a surprise, emotional moment after the fight where he broke down in tears talking about his mental health issues and, feeling anxiety and not feeling good enough. And I thought it was interesting that he mentioned that because that's something you wouldn't expect with a fighter like Danny. We know excuse me, how high strung his father normally is with press conferences and everything. And Danny's the calm and collected one. So you always figure he had it all together, but you never know what fighters are going through behind closed doors. And I think that Spence defeat really did a number on him mentally, probably because it's the first time in his career that he's lost um, I guess for lack of a better term, cleanly, where there was like no dispute. It wasn't a split decision. He couldn't, argue in his mind that, well, you know, I really won the fight, but the judges gave it to him. There was none of that. He was comprehensively beaten in that fight. And having a fight like that happen so late in his career, it probably, weighed on him mentally. And then the other thing that I think Adrian Broner is also going through now, we saw with his last explosion at his press conference that you can see on my YouTube channel. I think some of these fighters from the previous generation, they're having a hard time adjusting to the fact that they're no longer a priority. They've had their time in the sun, they've made their money, but just like anything, the fans and the networks are moving on to that next crop of fighters, and these older fighters are going to have to kind of struggle to find fight dates and find opponents. And I think that they're not used to that because, at one point, Danny was on top of the world, especially after that Matisse win, which I was ringside for. There was talk after that press conference of him even fighting Floyd. And he's been, kind of a top ticket seller at Barclays in particular for years now. But now things are different. He's older now. He's about close to 35 years old. Right now he's 34. So he's in the twilight of his career and he only has a few more fights left. So I think that all kind of weighed on him during this layoff as far as trying to figure out what's next. All these guys are moving on to these big either super fights or into retirement. And of course, he has no desire to really, fight these younger guys, still on the come up. So I think he was kind of in limbo mentally, and that kind of built the anxiety that he was going through. But hopefully he's better now. He looks like he's ready to get back in the mix. He talked about two opponents in particular, and those two opponents actually says a lot by who he didn't mention. The first one was Keith Thurman. He wants a rematch, and the reason for that is basically he mentioned that Thurman was the one that took his undefeated record in their first encounter. I think that's a good matchup. They're both, really welterweights at this point in their careers, so even the catchweight could work. I think that's a good quote unquote safe fight for both of them. They're around the same age. No harm, no foul on that one. So I wouldn't have no problems with that one as long as it's not on pay-per-view. Do not put that fight on pay-per-view. I know the dates are sparse at this point, but I mean, put that on next year's schedule. Do not try and put that in like October or November and put that on pay-per-view. Please don't. Just don't. The other fight he mentioned was Arislandi Lara at 155 as a catchweight for Lara's version of the middleweight title. That's an interesting fight. I don't think that's a good idea for Danny. I know he's probably thinking, well, Lara is slower now. It'll be easier to catch him, but not a good idea. Yes, Lara is slower, but the fact is, because he is slower, now he's sitting down more on his punches, which we see with a lot of older fighters. He has 3 knockouts in his last 4 fights. He still has that strong, very quick left hand. And I think with his size, that's a nightmare matchup for Danny. He's still going to be the much smaller man going in there with a technician that is faster than him and has a bigger punch than him. So I think Lara would actually embarrass him. I don't think that's a good matchup. I think he needs to stick with that Thurman matchup, if anything. What I mentioned earlier about those two matchups reflecting more so on who he didn't call out or mention was that Tony Harrison was ringside and said he'd love to fight Danny next. And Danny, when that name came up in the post-fight press conference and interview, he pretty much brushed it off. So that lets me know that he knows that is also another nightmare matchup for him. Tony being not only bigger than him, much longer, and would just jab him to death at long range and probably would shut him out. So that's a terrible matchup for him, and I'm glad he recognized that. And I don't think Danny has any interest in kind of the tier below that, which would be Jared Hurd, Terrell Goucher, Vito Mielnicki, who was on the undercard. I think that crop he's not really interested in. He really probably only has about, I would say maybe 2 or 3 more fights before calling it a career. He wants to make as much money as possible. So I think the Thurman matchup, at least for the short term, is the best bet. Now, the tier above that, I don't think that's a good idea either. We're talking about Jermell Charlo, Sebastian Fundora, Castano, and even guys like Carlos Adames, Erickson Lubin. Those guys are way too big and strong for him. So I think this middle level with Thurman in particular, that should be his main focus for the next fight. Outside of the main event, we also had Gary Antuane Russell scoring a controversial stoppage over Rance's Barthelemy. Controversial only because the referee basically ruined it for both of them. Yada yada. I don't care what you say, there is no excuse for stopping a fight like that. Yes, anytime a fighter gets up from a hard knockdown like that, they are going to be a little bit buzzed, but guess what? This is what they trained for. This is what they sacrifice months on end of time with their family to be prepared for those tough moments. So when the referee makes a stoppage like that, it robs both fighters. Number one, it robs Barthelemy of putting his training into play, putting his body in the tip-top shape to survive those tough moments and to hopefully come back. And then on the other end with Russell, who's trying to build on that Postal victory, which also for some people was a controversial stoppage, it robs him of the opportunity of having a signature victory or a signature highlight reel knockout, which he had a good chance of achieving in that round. So it robs both the fighters. Terrible stoppage. Nothing really more to discuss about that. It's just I don't want to see that referee again. That's not the type of stoppage that you would expect on a high level triple header on a network on a major network, excuse me. That's something you expect on like a club card off TV. So that was just terrible. So I feel for both fighters, but as far as Russell goes, I feel he was a little bit anxious in this fight to try and get that knockout. He was doing good work when he backed Barthélemy up and worked the body, but I think he got too anxious when he was jumping in with these hooks looking for the knockout. He did eventually knock him down, but he really put himself in danger. He got buzzed a couple times. Luckily, Barthélemy's not a big puncher, And I think that's why he got a little bit reckless and just kind of winging those shots. But that's a learning experience. Anytime you're in with a veteran fighter like that, I don't care if he's a light puncher, you give him shots like that, he's going to make you pay. So hopefully Russell has learned from that. Just looking at him and over his last couple fights, he's going to be a tough out. He is very physically strong, and I think he's going to be a big problem for the majority of fighters at 140. The unfortunate thing is that the division is so fragmented. A lot of the guys that I would want to see him in there with, who I think can possibly match his physical strength, are not with PBC and Showtime. I'm talking about Josh Taylor, who's probably not long for 140. He's probably out of there already. Jose Ramirez is another one. The main one that I would love to see is him and actually Regis Prograis. I feel like that's a potential fighter of the year, both of them being strong inside fighters, but I don't know that Pro Bellum situation. I don't even know if that's possible. One fight that is possible that's in-house, I don't know if they're ready to make it at this early stage, would be him and Subriel Matias. Matias, he is very adept at fighting inside and holding his ground and counterpunching. I think that's the perfect style matchup, but they're both young fighters on the come up. I don't know if PBC is willing to do that because we already see there's a little bit of resistance going on at a higher weight class at 168 with David Benavidez and David Morrell, who are both younger fighters. There seems to be reluctance to put them in together at this early point in their career. But I always use the Miguel Cotto and Carlos Quintana example. Two young guns like that in the same division, put them in there and let the cream rise to the top, just like we saw with Cotto and Quintana. So I say put them in there, Gary Russell and Matthias, and see who comes out on top. No reason to delay that fight now, especially with a good amount of the 140 fighters being on other networks. So we'll see what happens with that, what will happen with that. But I'm very high on Gary Russell. I think he's going to be one of the top fighters in the division and a very tough fighter to beat. Last thing to mention very briefly will be Adam Kownacki. This is probably his last fight of relevance. He lost his third straight fight, this one to Ali Aaron Darameza. Excuse me if I mispronounced his last name. Um, it only took about a minute in that fight for Kownacki to kind of show his usual style of just coming forward, low defense, and just winging punches. But unfortunately, those punches are not having the same effect now. Um, Daramesan, he held his ground and just beat up Kownacki over the course of the fight. This is probably the most exhausted I've seen Kownacki in a fight. By those later rounds, he had almost no energy and he was getting teed off on, his orbital bone might be broke again, because his eye was very swollen, his left eye, and cut as well. He was just getting his head snapped back repeatedly, getting hurt with these shots, and unable to hurt his opponent back. That's the main difference we've seen since the Helenius fight is that these punches are really having a big effect on him. Because he's always had these rock'em sock'em fights with Chris Arreola, Gerald Washington, but he could take everything that was coming towards him. But now at this higher level, he can't take this punishment. It's visibly breaking him down every single round. So he admitted as much in the post-fight interview that he feels like he just wants to have one more fight to end his career, with a win, which I can respect. I think he's 34 years old as well. So, this is the third straight fight where he's taken heavy, heavy punishment. I just think he realizes that, there's really nowhere to go from here. So I feel like he's earned, maybe just that one more fight, either off TV or maybe on a preliminary Showtime YouTube card off of TV just to get that win to close out his career, just so he can hold his head up high. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I think he's making a very good decision, realizing that at this point, I probably just need one more fight and to hang it up. No reason taking any unnecessary punishment. He's made some decent money. He had the entire Polish community in New York backing him every single fight. Can't ask for more than that. He's got the most that he can get out of his talent. That's the most you can ask of any boxer. So let me wrap this up. Let me know what you think about this Showtime triple header. One last thing to add, the most unfortunate thing about this triple header was that we got no information on the rest of Showtime's schedule. That is the main thing I kind of tuned in for. I'm like, are we going to get anything about not even Spence and Crawford, but anything about about what's happening in October. I mean, maybe Wilder's come back because with boxing, we got to plan in advance to make these dates and get hotel rooms, travel, and all that good stuff. And we got none of that. So that was very disappointing. It kind of feels like the same thing that's going on in the NBA with the Durant trade and maybe Donovan Mitchell. It's like everything is on hold until probably Wilder and Spence Crawford gets sorted out as far as their next fights. It's kind of like holding up the entire schedule. So I'm hoping we got to hear something by at least mid-August. I mean, it's funny, we didn't even get an official announcement about the Jake Paul card next week being canceled. We got that on social media. So hopefully in a week or two, we're going to get some answers about Spence Crawford or at least about the rest of the Showtime schedule. I'm hopeful that we will, but it's really just a wait and see at this point. All right, guys, I thank you for tuning in. Let me know your thoughts on this card, and we'll be talking with you soon.